Depending on where you are joining us from, either good morning or good afternoon. I saw people as far away as California. I'm Douglas Poe, the director of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership at Wesley Theological Seminary, and I want to welcome you to Participation and Presence, Leading Meaningful Digital Worship. As many of you know, over the past year, congregations have experienced transformational disruptions. Adapting worship because of the pandemic has been a real challenge for many. And many of you are wondering, as we move towards seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, what's next? Well, today we're going to share some ideas with you for what comes next. But before I get started, I want to introduce to you our presenter and a few of the staff at the Lewis Center for Church Leadership who are working behind the scenes to make all of this possible. Our presenter for this webinar is Dr. Tim Snyder. Dr. Snyder serves as Visiting Assistant Professor of Practical Theology at Wesley Theological Seminary and Senior Researcher at the Lewis Center for Church Leadership, where he is the Principal Investigator for the Religious Workforce Project, a 3-year national study of congregational leadership funded by the Lilly Endowment. We do keep him very busy. Everything happens at the Lewis Center because of a team effort, and I would like to introduce a couple of our gifted team members. Reina Villanueva Unger is our multimedia specialist at the Lewis Center, and she's working behind the scenes today, providing technical assistance for the webinar. And Matt Lyons, who serves as marketing manager at the Lewis Center, will be facilitating a lot of the audience participation during the webinar. We are excited to put this on for you all. Please ask plenty of questions. I now turn it over to Dr. Tim Snyder.
Thank you so much for that introduction, Dr. Poe, and thanks to the Lewis Center for Church Leadership for hosting this webinar today. I'd like to begin with a brief overview of what you can expect over the next 75 minutes or so. The webinar will include several segments, and following each segment, we will have a chance to hear from you, our participants. During the first 2 segments, I'll share some of the big ideas and insights that have emerged from studying religion and congregational studies in a digital context. Then I'll share 2 case studies of congregations that are doing exemplary digital worship, one that uses a live streaming approach and another that uses video conferencing. I'll conclude our time together with some key actionable insights that will help you make the most of your digital context. As we go along, feel free to go ahead and submit questions in the Q&A box. We'll have several opportunities between segments to take up your questions. But before we get started, let's get to know each other just a little bit. In just a second, we'll launch a quick poll where you'll be invited to share a little bit about you and your ministry context. You'll have just a few minutes to answer the questions before we have to close the poll and move along. So try to answer the questions right away. After we've closed the poll, we'll share the instant results so that you can have a better idea of who's here. So let's try this. Raina, can you go ahead and bring up that first poll? We'll take a few minutes, just 1 or 2 minutes to complete this poll, and then we'll let you see the results. Okay, we'll give you just a few more seconds, maybe 10 seconds or so to complete this poll. So if you haven't submitted your answers, go ahead and click through. All right. Raina, would you be willing to show us the results of that first poll? All right, so it looks like we have a good number of folks from the Northeast, the Southeast, quite a few from the Midwest, and even some friends out in the Southwest and the western part of the country. That's great. And we have quite a few folks from, we have a real diversity of folks, it looks like, folks who who have just getting going in ministry and some real veterans as well. That's just great. And there you can see in the third one, a large contingent of our friends from the mainline Protestant tradition. That's great. And a good mix of folks using different kinds of platforms to do their digital worship, some pre-recorded broadcasting and some live streams, some video conferencing. That's just great. And a little bit of a mix too in terms of worship styles. We have some lots of traditional and liturgical worship folks in here and some contemporary folks and a good amount of hybrid and blended as well. Thanks so much for doing that. We'll have a couple of other opportunities for you to chime in as well. All right. Let's dive into some of the insights that we've learned from studying religion and congregations in a digital context. I'd like to begin by debunking a few persistent myths about digital worship. And here I'm using the word myth intentionally. These are things that you've probably heard others say. I know that I actually used to say some of these things, and perhaps you have too. But we can say that they are myths because researchers have been studying religious communities online for several decades now. And there is a strong consensus among scholars about these three myths. The first myth is that digital worship is not real worship. You'll notice that in our promotional materials for this webinar, we've been using the phrase digital worship instead of virtual worship. And that's on purpose. Now, the word virtual has two very different meanings. For example, we might say of a close friend that they're virtually family, or we might say something is virtually impossible. But virtual can also mean something that is computer or software generated. For example, there's virtual environments, or perhaps some of you over the past year have used or even heard of virtual choir. As a description of Christian worship, virtual can be a little confusing of a description because while some may simply intend to say that it's the kind of worship made possible by computers or software, others have conflated the two meanings in order to suggest that virtual worship is just that. It's virtually worship, it's almost worship, but not completely worship. It's not real worship, they would say. And this has long been a problem. There is a common assumption that what happens in digital contexts are somehow less real than the kinds of things that we do in person. Social media theorist Nathan Jurgensen calls folks who hold this kind of a view, he calls them digital dualists. Digital dualists will say that anything that's online is not real or authentic, while being everything that we do in person is what is actually real. But given the developments of the last 2 decades, this is a distinction that's pretty hard to maintain. For many, if not most of us today, our daily living is no longer divided by practices that are either online or offline, digital or in person. They're both. Because we live in what Yale liturgical scholar Teresa Berger calls digitally suffused lives. We live in digitally suffused lives. Christian leaders, especially those of us who plan and lead worship, will particularly have a difficult time with this idea that digital worship is not real worship. Because theologically, worship is most basically about a relationship between God and God's people. All of our lives, in fact, are lived before God in worship, in lives of worship. Worship happens whenever God's people turn to God in prayer, in lament, in grief, in thanksgiving, and in praise. However, and whenever God's people turn to God, God shows up. Digital contexts may indeed have their limits. We know that from this past year. But God is not particularly changed by these limitations that we've created. If God knows what's in our heart of hearts, and if God knows what we need before we even ask it, I suspect God can probably figure out Facebook and text messaging. The second myth is that digital worship is disembodied. For Christians, bodies and material things, our physical presence and proximity to each other is very important. Just think of how often bodies and physical proximity comes up in Jesus's ministry. There's the woman whose bleeding can't be stopped, and she touches his clothes. And as she does so, Jesus asks, Who touched me? It's as if he can feel some of his power leaving as she's healed. And who can forget the blind man in John's gospel where Jesus takes the mud and puts it over his eyes, just in order to heal him, right? And of course, Lazarus, who was already starting to stink when Jesus raised him from the dead. We could go on, but the point is, it's not surprising that during this time of social distancing, Christians yearn to be closer to one another. We yearn for the familiar forms of our embodied faith. And along with that, there is this idea that digital worship is disembodied. And I get it. It certainly can feel that way. But the reality is that if you look more broadly at the full range of Christian practices that are actually happening online, I think you will find that they're surprisingly embodied. Many apps, for example, invite people of faith to pay attention to their breathing. Clicks, swipes, and other bodily gestures are often incorporated into prayer practices. One of my favorite apps facilitates the liturgy of the hours, a practice pretty common in liturgical traditions. But it even includes some communal singing so that when you're invited to sing along, it doesn't feel quite as alone as it otherwise would. So I think that the question is not really whether or not we use our bodies to practice our faith online. The question is really, how are we invited to use our bodies? Now, over the last few months here at the Lewis Center, we've been involved in a major study of congregations in the Washington, D.C. metro area. And so I've gotten to worship digitally, of course, with all kinds of congregations, small ones, big ones, urban ones, suburban ones. I've worshiped with energetic Black churches and in very formal Episcopal churches, all from this same office chair, which is how I know that digital worship can be embodied. My back hurts. And here's what I've noticed. Some congregations are very good at inviting participants to engage in bodily and material practices, but most aren't. Most digital worship just simply hasn't invited participants to attend to their bodies. No invitations to stand or sit, to breathe deeply or sit in silence. No invitation to reach out or shake someone's hand or hug a loved one, even if those folks are just the other members of your household. Few invitations to click links or interact with the screen itself. It's been mostly passive by design. And so one of the very best things you can do to improve your digital worship is to think through each part and to ask yourself how it is that your participants might be experiencing it. Is this a passive experience or an active one? If the former, see if you can't come up with an invitation to invite your participants to actually do something, anything, because a little bit goes a long way. A third myth is that digital worship is individualistic. Now, when I talk to pastors about digital worship, the number one concern that I hear is that it makes worship a little too convenient. And it's a concern, I think, that's grounded in the myth that digital worship appears to be individualistic. It appears that digital worship is something we all do by ourselves, whenever and wherever we like. And if this were the case, you can certainly understand why pastors are sounding the alarm. The problem is, as we all know, things aren't always how they appear. Perhaps you saw this image that went viral a few years ago. It appears to show a group of school-aged children in a museum staring at their phones, completely ignoring one of Rembrandt's most famous paintings, just a few feet from them. Twitter, of course, was quick to criticize. The only problem is that what these kids were actually doing was working on a collaborative assignment using the museum's smartphone app. They weren't actually ignoring the painting at all. They were learning more about it in their own way as digital natives. For those of us who study digital religion, this is a common experience. We often find ourselves helping others see that there is much more going on in digital context than it first appears. When it comes to digital worship, as many of you know, many families are worshiping together, and it's anything but convenient. Just ask a family with young children. And while social practices in a digital context certainly look a lot different than some of the in-person ones we're used to, they are nonetheless social. They most often invite real and authentic connections with God and with other people. After nearly 3 decades of research on online communities, we can definitively say that the advent of the internet and social media has widely expanded who we can connect with and how we connect with each other. Online churches have existed since long before the pandemic, and research shows that these communities share many, if not all, of the most important features of in-person communities. And what's even more than that is that they often reach people who would otherwise never attend another church. Okay, that's enough for me for a moment. Let's see what you're thinking. In a second, another poll will show up on your screen. And again, take another minute or two to complete the brief poll. After a few minutes have passed, we'll show what others have been thinking about. Some of these choices are, of course, a little bit longer than the last one. So we'll give you about another 30 seconds on this one. Maybe just 10 more seconds on this. Okay, Raina, let's see what others are thinking about. All right. That's great. As you can see, while a strong majority of folks have certainly experienced digital worship to be real, at least in its own way, it's still a difficult experience, and some people just can't go there. And I think that's just fine. Totally understand that. Yeah, here you can see there's a little bit of a range too of ways that congregations, at least your congregations, have been engaging digital worship. And of course, on that last one, a little bit of your own personal experiences, but it seems like a good number of you have been able to experience a sense of community, both within the church and outside of the church as well in a digital context. That's really great to see. If you get nothing else out of this webinar, I hope that you take this away, that worship in a digital context requires translation. In fact, researchers often use the phrase digital culture as a way of describing how technology and the internet are reshaping the ways we interact together. Digital culture brings with it a unique way of behaving, unique ways of thinking, communicating, creating, and much more. But here's the good news. There's actually a long history within Christianity of worship taking root in new cultures and becoming creative and innovative forms of Christian practice. In fact, along with Teresa Berger, I want to suggest that the most important questions that digital worship raises are basic questions that transcend worship in any cultural context. That is, that they are questions about participation and presence, questions we need to be asking about our digital worship and our in-person worship. My friend Johnny Baker has this wonderful line about the purpose of Christian worship. He says that worship imagines a world. Now notice he doesn't say that worship ought to imagine a world. He says it already does. And so the question then becomes, what kind of world does your worship imagine? Now, that probably sounds like a very abstract question, but really I think it's a design question. Asking yourself, what kind of world does our worship imagine? It can be a helpful way of asking difficult, evaluative questions about your worship. How does the worship we plan imagine relationships between pastors and participants? Who gets to speak and who doesn't? Do the images that we use depict the fullness of humanity as God created it to be? Or do they just reflect us in our little group? Does our worship planning center on the style of worship we like, or does it try to discern where God is calling us to take more risks, to go out into the margins, or otherwise disrupt those things we hold dear? And once you've explored some of those questions, here's two more that you might consider. What does it look like to fully participate in worship? And what does it look like to be fully present for worship? Participation and presence. These are two of the most important invitations of our communal worship: to be present to ourselves, to each other, and to God, and to participate actively in a community at worship. Now, it's helpful to sit back and ask these big picture questions, because then you can translate them into your digital context. If you're not clear about your own answers to these questions, it's going to be hard to take full advantage of the digital context. Now, for the purposes of this webinar, let's talk about the two basic platforms for digital worship, because each of them have their own kind of logic. The two that we see most commonly are broadcasting and video conferencing. Broadcasting, of course, would include either pre-recorded broadcasts that are then released at a certain time, or live stream. That's also a form of broadcasting. And video conferencing, of course, is Zoom, Google Meetings, Skype, and all the rest. Now, keep these big picture questions on the left side of your screen in the front of your mind, because I want to share some of the limits and possibilities that we've seen in each of these platforms. So broadcasting and video conferencing. Each of these, of course, have their own possibilities and limits. Neither of these two are inherently better than the other. In our congregational research, we've seen very good examples of broadcasting, both pre-recorded and live stream. And we've seen not so good examples. And likewise, we've seen really good examples of Zoom worship, and we've seen a lot of not so good examples. Now, in a few minutes, I'll share a couple of case studies, one from each of these two platforms. But first, let's take a little bit to just name some of those possibilities and limits. I'm going to just adjust my screen on my end. Give me a second. So some of the possibilities of broadcasting include some things like this. With broadcasting, many congregations have found that they're able to build and use their existing infrastructure, whether that be cameras because they're already live streaming, or just their audio system that they already have in their worship facility. There's also a really great possibility in broadcasting as a modality, because you can get a very high production value. That means more control over things like the quality of your video and your audio, and ability to capture different kinds of movement that might be happening in your worship setting. And through broadcasting, you can achieve a media-rich worship experience that's very engaging. In fact, sometimes it's a little counterintuitive, but sometimes that high production value broadcasting worship is even easier to participate in, because it's more similar to what we're used to seeing on Netflix and in our TVs and in the movies. It's a little bit closer to that. And so we're really quite familiar, quite fluent with participating in that. Video conferencing, though, has its own possibilities, of course. One of the best ones is that it requires little to no infrastructure. I'm sure many of you have already experienced that. It's highly interactive in that there's an equal opportunity to be seen and heard. And one of my favorite things about it is that it actually blurs the distinction between ritual and our everyday lives. What I mean by that is, because everybody's video can be on, at least, sometimes they don't actually turn those videos on. But when those videos are all on, you have that wonderful tile background. You get to see the very stuff of our everyday lives, little windows into the everyday lives where we're trying to live out our faith as disciples of Jesus Christ. Also, in today's world, video conferencing like Zoom has become so ubiquitous that using it for worship is almost a way of sort of blessing that everyday curse that many of us experience. Many of us are on too many Zoom calls, but it's a way of transforming that ubiquitous part of everyday life into a ritual moment, into a sacred space. So I think that has a lot of possibilities. And I think we've seen some congregations in our research really take advantage of that, take their worship to all kinds of places, to street corners and local businesses, all of that through the video conferencing platform. It's produced some very creative possibilities. But of course, there's significant limitations to each as well. For broadcasting, it is true, I think, that often to do it well requires a significant investment in technology and staffing. And participation and presence can be limited to the chat or perhaps even to just pre-recorded contributions. And those have real limitations. Video conferencing, though, is also quite limited in other ways. I think it can be quite difficult to make Zoom actually feel like worship. And one of the things I think many congregations struggle with is how to do music well on Zoom. There, you're pretty much only limited to those pre-recordings. There's a couple of other things you might do to have better quality music on Zoom, but it can be very limiting to music. And for many of us, music is such an important part of that worship experience. So in short, broadcasting is best for capturing musical performances, staged actions, and video conferencing is best for facilitating structured conversations. Now, neither of those may be perfect fits for your congregation's in-person worship, but that's why digital worship requires translation. Okay, let's pause here and let's see if we can't take some of those questions that you've been submitting. I know there's several of them that have been submitted, both ahead of time and already. Matt, do we have a question or two that we might pause here and wonder about?
Yes, we do. One quick question. What is the name of the app you described that invited people into communal singing?
Oh, that's great. I'll have to go find it. My phone is not near me right now. We'll include that in it. We have a handout that's coming, and we will include that. And there's a list of resources. There's a handout that we're going to be sending as a follow-up. It has all the information on these PowerPoint slides. In addition, it has some additional resources that we're including in that packet. I'll include that in that packet so that you have it. That's a great question.
I have another that was sent in. We have been live streaming since before the pandemic, but of course now everyone is doing this. We have a pretty nice camera, but our options are basically to zoom in on me or zoom out, which shows an empty sanctuary, which is kind of depressing. Any ideas for camera placement or how we can make this feel like people are there?
Yeah, it's a really great question. It's something that we see a lot of in our research. One of the things that when we're doing in-person worship, a lot of times congregations are building on infrastructure that was already in place. And one of the most common places to actually put a camera, it tends to be like way in the back in some upper corner. And you can, of course, zoom really far in. Of course, the more you zoom, the sort of worse quality you're going to get in most cameras. So that can be a bit of a challenge. But that's kind of a weird point of view, because when you're in a worship space, nobody, unless you're in the balcony, I guess, nobody really sits that high. It can feel a bit like you're a mall cop kind of spying down on people. It's kind of a weird camera angle. On the other hand, we've seen quite a few congregations take advantage of different camera angles by really doing what's called a point of view camera, which is basically just taking a camera and putting it somewhere that an actual worship participant would really sit in the congregation. If you have the capability of doing multiple camera angles, this is really a really nice and interesting way to get some mix in there and kind of mix it up, and also give people the feeling that they're really there. That's not a sort of a natural camera angle, and sometimes it yields kind of unique angles, but it can add a lot of visual interest, and we've seen a lot of congregations do that really effectively.
Another question for you about music and Zoom. That you had mentioned that it's hard to have live music on Zoom, but that's what they've got. Is there anything they can do to improve that?
Yeah, I mean, the best thing you can do for that is to use an external microphone, to not rely on the microphone that's built into your device, whether that's a laptop or a smartphone or even a tablet. Those microphones are getting better and better, but those are, for the most part, microphones that are designed to pick up the human voice and not a musical instrument. But if you can get an external microphone, they make a whole variety of really simple microphones that you just plug right into your computer. That can make a big difference. If you do that, Zoom recently launched a different, they launched a new setting. It's inside of the Zoom settings, and you're going to want to look for, after you sign in, you go to settings, you go to meeting settings into audio. There's going to be an option to turn on what's called the preserve original audio. And when you're using that external microphone on a Zoom meeting, you'll have in the upper left-hand corner a little extra button all of a sudden, and it says keep original audio. If you use that, you can enable it, and that produces much better audio quality for musical instruments, whether that's a guitar, whether it's a piano, or even like an organ. You can really pick up a lot of different things that way. And that's a really good way to get at least a little bit better audio. What that's going to do basically is Zoom has a lot of echo cancellation and stuff like that built into the software. Again, that's great for the human voice when we're trying to have video conferencing conversations. But taking that off will really help your musical experience a lot. It'll kind of cancel that. That can be a very helpful feature.
We have several questions on this. Is there a way to combine broadcast and video conference worship? Also, can we both live stream via Facebook and Zoom at the same time?
Yeah, that's a great question. We have seen in our research a couple of different things being done that I think we've seen them be quite effective. There are some platforms that will let you do several things simultaneously. In other words, host a live stream in one place, like on your church website, but also push that out to a variety of social media platforms. The most effective way that we've seen it, Zoom and live stream be combined, is to begin to have a worship service basically that is live streamed, and then to include some kind of fellowship time afterwards that there's a Zoom link and people jump in. And this way you kind of get the best of both worlds. There are ways to broadcast out your Zoom meeting. The challenge about that is, again, a lot of your limitations in terms of music and sound quality and otherwise are going to actually end up in that broadcast. So on the technical front, that can be done, but it doesn't get you that much further along in sort of having a really effective quality experience.
Another question. This is a great question. We are live streaming on Facebook. We put our bulletin in parts in the comment section. Is there a better way to engage people online as we go back to both in person and online?
Yeah, that is a good question. I mean, I think the most important thing, again, is to step back and wonder along each part of your worship and ask that question. The bulletin may provide them opportunities to, more effectively follow along with the worship and so forth. But we've really found that the congregations that invite very specific forms of participation are the ones that get it. And it's very easy for digital worship to slip into this just very passive thing. You can imagine somebody at home on their couch. Maybe they've even printed that bulletin that you sent them or put in the comments. But the worship doesn't ask them to do as many things, because of course we're not all there gathered together, and so this creates some interesting tension. So I would say take each part of your worship and wonder if there are specific things that you might add to that. A lot of congregations have added or done even more than they ordinarily would, of litanies and call and response. There have been some really creative uses of the chat box, and I think that's a really important feature. That's probably one of the things I don't love as much about the way Facebook Live does theirs. It's kind of a stream, and it's a little bit harder to do some of the back and forth that we've seen in other chat features, but it can still work. It can be pretty effective as well. Many congregations, I think, have figured out that when they're combining different platforms, so maybe they live stream, but then also send it out to Facebook or whatever, some people end up commenting in one place, and then other people end up commenting in another place. So you never really get that sort of maximum kind of energy or really feeling like we're all in this together. And that can be a challenge too. So I think you just want to invite people into very specific things. Ask them to respond in the middle of your sermon to this chat. invite them to use polls and things like that to really engage them in different ways. Matt, should we keep going for now? We'll come back. We'll have a couple of opportunities to do more questions, but let's jump into some of the case studies. Some of them might actually help people see some of what we mean by some of these. That might actually help some of these questions. Does that sound good?
That sounds great.
All right. For this first case study, these are case studies from the Religious Workforce Project. And because all of our congregations in that study are anonymous, we can't actually share with you the specific names of these congregations. So we've kind of hidden their identity, kind of made them a little bit generic, but we still thought it'd be helpful to show you some exemplary uses of digital worship this way. This first one is a historically Black church that's coming out of the Baptist tradition. And they're located in an urban neighborhood. They have, pre-pandemic anyway, they would have about 300 folks in worship. They have a relatively young senior pastor and a relatively young associate pastor and about 5 other part-time staff. They did have some live streaming before the pandemic, but today the congregation really produces a very high quality live stream broadcast that highlights the church's emphasis on contemporary Black gospel music. So this is a congregation that every week is bringing in professional musicians to do their music. So as you might imagine, that's why they've chosen the broadcast platform. Music is such an important part of their worship experience. They just really couldn't imagine worshiping without that quality of musician. The preaching really connects faith in everyday life, lots of use of PowerPoint slides, and that would have been the in-person experience, which is fairly easy to replicate and translate into that digital context. But this is also a congregation that really connects viewers with a whole bunch of different ways that they can practice their faith in their daily lives. So they have a daily conference call prayer line. They've had several voter registration events leading up this past fall. A weekly Bible study and community outreach. And in each one of those invitations, the daily prayer, voter registration, all of that, all of these had both sort of in-person elements and digital elements. So they were really invited to take pictures of themselves at voter registration. Their Bible studies are connected to Facebook Live, so there's also ways to do that. They also have Facebook groups, private Facebook groups where people can share a little bit more personal sharing coming out of those Bible studies and stuff. So everything is multi-site, if you will. It has both online components and in-person components, and it was just a very sort of dynamic use of all of those possibilities. And I think what was really amazing about this is you could tell, going back to that question about what kind of world does your worship imagine? This digital worship really imagines a world where the church is a daily part of our lives. It's a church that has high levels of participation because, really at every turn of their digital worship, they're inviting that kind of participation. Their presence in their chat, I'll show you in a minute a picture of their chat. But their chat feels just like it does when you walk into their building. It's warm, it's inviting, it's high energy. For us, this was a really exemplary congregation doing digital worship because it draws really on the personality and culture of the congregation. I think the more you're in tune with the personality and the culture of your own congregation, the easier it is to translate of what that could look like in a digital context. The quality of their live stream is really quite good, but it's being driven by weekly production meetings. They have a staff meeting on Mondays, and they spend the first 30 minutes inviting every volunteer and every staff person who's involved in digital work, in the production of worship. And they come and they critique everything. They critique the look and the feel of the announcement slides, the lighting choices, the song choices. And the pastor, I think, really is taking the lead here and is really clear that, they want all the criticism because they want to get better. Now, they can't fix everything at once, and little by little, they've gotten better. So they're in a much different place than when the pandemic started. There's no doubt that what you would see today if you showed up to this congregation is not at all what some of those early live stream things were, March of last year, for example. Just a really incredible use. Here's a sort of, so let's go back to participation and presence. Their very extraordinarily active chat was, I think, they did a really great job of inviting participation. And the presence was really kind of amazing too. This is a congregation that before the pandemic and during the pandemic, of course, has this tradition where at the end of each time of preaching, the pastor will invite folks into a prayer of salvation. It's a very important part of their tradition. And he prays this very specific prayer and he invites people to pray with him. Now, if they were doing this in person, they might invite people up to the front and have a group of people to pray with them. But in this context, they've secured an additional text line and a hotline, and they put that up on the screen, and he'll say something like, if you're praying this prayer for the first time, text this number on the screen, text us right now, we want to hear from you. And if you do that, they have folks in the congregation lined up and ready to go to receive those texts and to correspond, to get folks plugged in. And so they've thought through how they're going to do this in that context. It's not exactly what they would do in person, but this is how they're doing it in a digital context. A very creative, very orchestrated, but very approachable way of doing that. It's very interesting. It's the only group that we've seen that's really done it quite like that. Here's let's see if we can get you a photo. There we go. Here's a slide that just shows just a very small glimpse in a typical worship service for this congregation. There can be well over 100, 200 chats in their chat box. And so we've blurred these out for privacy purposes, but the highlighted ones that you can see there, that's the official count of the church. And so that represents an actual staff person who's behind there making it happen. And although you can't see it because the names are blurred out, I can share with you that the associate pastor is also one of the people chatting quite often. So you also have a leader who's in there modeling the very kind of participation that they're hoping that they can get from their chat. So they're asking for it, they're inviting it, and they're modeling it. And because of that, this chat is off the hook. It goes on and on. You can get lost in this chat while the worship is going on. I may have gotten lost a few times in the chat myself. Let's pause here and take a few more questions, Matt.
All right, here's a one on privacy. We've had privacy concerns with the congregational camera. Are the only options either to have no congregational camera or a blanket expectation that people consent by attending?
This is a difficult one. It's an important question. The most important thing I think for pastors is to have active conversations with their congregations about this. It's a complicated issue because on the one hand, most of us church leaders tend to think about worship as a certain kind of public event. What we mean by that is that in most cases, we want our doors to be open and we want people to feel welcome, anybody to come, whoever they might be, to be able to come to our worship. And so in that sense, worship feels like a public thing. It's open to the public. On the other hand, there are some significant privacy concerns. There are examples that we have seen from some of our, not from our research, but from some of our work with congregations. Anecdotally, I know of congregations where there's folks in the congregation that have, for example, very good reasons why they might not want their images plastered all over the internet. It's one of the challenging things about the digital context is that once something is out there on the internet, it's very difficult to control how that works and where that's going. So I think that it is challenging. We have seen congregations that have Of course, this is more for when you're doing a hybrid situation, and we can have more people inside our sanctuaries. But once we're at that point in this country, we have seen I've seen congregations have certain zones in the congregational gathering space that aren't on camera, so that if you're a person who really doesn't want to be on camera, you can do that. On the other hand, you can also have it to where that way you can kind of have it both ways too. But this is really it's a complicated deal, and I think that congregations need to make decisions collectively about this, about whether or not they want their images to be broadcast out like that. It's complicated, no doubt, and no doubt that one of the things that digital culture is causing us to rethink is questions around privacy. So it's a great question. There's no one size fits all, I'm afraid. You're going to have to talk to your congregation and work that out.
Just wanted to remind everyone that there are some fantastic back and forth conversations going on in the chat right now. People asking questions, people saying what's worked for them. So please check that out. And here's a question. Oh my goodness, I feel their pain on this one. We're using Zoom and I find it hard to manage all the screen shares and chats. How are others doing this?
Yeah, most of the really good Zoom worship that I've participated in, it's pretty clear that they have a dedicated technology person, perhaps even more than one person using that co-host feature. It can also help to do some education with your people, depending on who your people are. We had one congregation. This was a relatively small congregation, so they could do it this way. But when the pandemic started and they moved to a Zoom worship, they literally gathered up several young people in the congregation, and they went and did one-on-one tutorials on Zoom with every single person in their congregation. Now, this is a small congregation. There's about 50 regular participants. So, that's a reasonable thing to do. But a little bit of education can go a long way. Taking a few minutes at the beginning of a service to share your screen and show people how to manipulate the different views that Zoom offers can be really helpful. I think in most cases, people who are leading Zoom worship are going to want the host to be able to control that mute button, so that when you have somebody who may not even be aware that their sound is still on and interfering with the worship, you can take care of that. So I think in most cases, you're going to want your leaders to be as present as possible. And I think, frankly, that's pretty difficult when you also have to manage the technology. So I think it's going to have to be a real team effort, and you'll have to get together. You'll have to practice going through some of those if there's some complicated exchanges. Sometimes folks are using that share screen functionality to do music or to share videos for children's messages and things like that. And I think you're going to want to rehearse that and practice that so you can get as smooth as possible. And again, that's hard to lead when to both lead the worship and be fully present to that and manage the technology. So I'd really encourage you to recruit other volunteers in and let other people be a part of that leadership experience.
I have actually some in-depth questions, but I'll save those for the next Q&A. But just one real quick one.
Sure.
When we're in person, we have traditional service and the contemporary service. Are some platforms better for certain worship styles?
Yeah, that's a great question. We get this question, I get this question anyway, quite a bit. I don't think so. I think the sort of most critical question, sort of deciding between those two, is this question of how you're going to do the music. In much of the liturgical tradition, it would just be very difficult to even translate worship into a digital context without high quality music. And that's just going to be very, very difficult on Zoom. Now, there are ways to do that. If you use pre-recorded music, it's possible to then thread that high quality music into the experience. You'll still have to make some of those awkward decisions about, are you going to invite people to sing with mute on, or how are you going to sort of do that? Will you have a cantor help them along? There's all kinds of different ways you can do that. But that, to me, is the real linchpin of it all. How do you want to do music? On the other hand, if you're broadcasting, basically, if you're broadcasting, anything that you can do musically, you can broadcast. So that really does make things a lot more possible. And that would go for any style of worship as well. So I think it's not so much that some platforms are better for certain styles, is you really have to sort of think about the role of the staging. Is it important? What is it that people will see? And then also really think about the music. I think that's what really drives it for a lot of this. Should we keep going? We'll have another round soon, I think.
Yeah, let's just go ahead and keep going.
All right, very good. Let's go on to our second case study here. Okay. The second case study comes from a small urban mainline Protestant congregation. It's served by a really dynamic husband and wife pastoral team, but that husband and wife team also is serving two other congregations. Before the pandemic, they had relatively low and inconsistent participation, really across all three congregations. And because of their location in a pretty disenfranchised neighborhood, it's a community that has few resources. They didn't, of course, have any digital worship pre-pandemic, but the congregation today produces a very high energy Zoom worship that combines participants from all three congregations served by the pastoral team. The pastors have decided to really focus on worship themes that emphasize shared leadership, personal growth, and a lot of encouragement, which I think has really been the right pitch during a pandemic. I think we could all use a really encouraging atmosphere sometimes, and they never fail to deliver the encouragement. It's really great. Because they now actually spend less time planning their worship, they've reported to us anyway, that they're now able to spend more time in their local community assessing and addressing the needs of the community, which is a really sort of inspiring response to the pandemic, I think. So we might say that their digital worship imagines a world where the church exists to tell stories that testify to God's work in their lives and to God's work in their neighborhood. This is a church that before the pandemic could never in a million years have imagined bringing together these three churches. But now that they are worshiping together, they have this wonderfully renewed energy for encouraging one another and reaching out into their neighborhood. This is really an exemplar of digital worship that draws heavily on the unique gifts of the pastor, but it also, I think, demonstrates a willingness to take some risks. I think from one point of view, if we were to all show up in this Zoom worship, that would be hard, all 200 of us. But if we were to all show up, I think you might agree with me that the worship itself is really nothing special. The music is borrowed from YouTube. It doesn't really make a lot of sense for this congregation. The overall sound and video quality are frankly what one might expect from a congregation that has spotty internet service. But the energy itself is outright contagious and powerful. When it comes to their participation and presence, they have this heavy use of testimony and shared leadership. In fact, the pastors do very little other than serve as basically masters of ceremonies. They've really just become, it's like a whole new model for pastoral leadership, I think. Their thematic services include things like this. It was right around Super Bowl Sunday, and they had this somewhat cheesy 4 quarters for Jesus theme. And for each quarter of the football game, as it were, they had a different person give an extended testimony. And so there were young people and old people and people who were sharing their testimony for the very first time. And it was very powerful. What the pastors would do is after, and in fact, even during using the chat, each one of these testimonies, the pastors took on this kind of role of cheerleader. And there was just this overwhelming encouragement from the congregation for every single one of these folks who was willing to share their testimony. This was amazing because it brought both this level of levity and playfulness that I think is really actually quite uncommon in worship. And it's, at least from our experience, but even more uncommon, ironically enough, in digital worship. Here's a picture from, here's a quick screen grab that I I took from one of the worship services that I visited them with. Let's see if I can get it to come up on your screen. And here you can see the pastors are dressed up as referees. They had whistles, they had footballs, they had everything. It's not something I would do. I probably wouldn't be brave enough to dress up as a referee and MC a digital worship service. But their willingness to take a risk, to be a little playful, to be a little goofy, I think that has been really a part of the energy of this congregation. But it's also been very welcome in the midst of a pandemic where moments of playfulness and levity just really haven't been as much a part of our everyday lives. So that's our second quick case study. Matt, let's go back to some questions.
All right. This is kind of a peering into the future question. What do you sense is the future of hybrid worship? Will people in 2 years still be demanding live stream worship as they do today? And complementary to that, do we think we will continue doing live stream from the actual in-person worship service, or will we be building a digital only worship platform?
That's a great question. Here's what I suspect. I'm not a fortune teller, so don't hold me to this. But here's what I suspect. It's clear that there have been congregations during the pandemic in this forced season of digital worship where they've invested heavily in digital worship. And by invested heavily, I don't necessarily mean thousands and thousands of dollars. I mostly just mean they've thought carefully about the design of their worship. Now, some of them, they've also included some significant financial investment. But many of those congregations have experienced growth, both in terms of numbers and in depth of experience. They've really found real and authentic ways to connect with people. And I think for congregations that are all in on that have really gone into the deep end head first with their digital worship, I think those congregations have experienced the fruits of it. They've been able to see the expanded participation. And I think those congregations will continue to do live stream long into the future. I think there's other congregations for which, for any number of good reasons, it's not been possible for them to be all in on digital worship. And I think because of that, likely they haven't seen the kind of real fruitful results. You can see this on the internet pretty often. There's some sort of mixed reporting, mixed survey data out there about whether or not churches have seen increased participation. There is some survey data to support that. There was a Gallup poll out towards the beginning of the pandemic. Frankly, I wouldn't put a whole lot of weight on that particular survey because when you dug into the methodology of it, this is a little bit wonky for a second, but it turns out that their entire sample came from medium to large congregations. So medium to large congregations are more likely to have the kind of resources to support both really high quality live stream services, but they're also able to market those services in a way that smaller congregations haven't. So, of course, they reported this like massive increase in their analytics in terms of the number of people that were joining their live stream. So, anecdotally in our research, we have seen that in some congregations. The vast majority of our congregations, though, have seen pretty significant declines in participation, and not just in worship, and other kinds of participation too. So, I think there's mixed results out there about that. And I think again, for those congregations that haven't been able to be all in on a digital worship experience, I suspect that they will let it go and that it won't be a part of their future. Whether or not we'll have sort of, I think the question was about dedicated live stream services as opposed to piggybacking off of the in-person one. I suspect we'll see both. I'm quite positive that both can work. We are seeing, at least in our research, some uptick of folks asking about the possibility or being interested in the possibility of hiring pastors who would be specifically dedicated to the online community, being the sort of set aside as the digital worship pastor or the digital online community pastor. They're calling them different things, but basically, just like you would have a different pastor for another campus, having a pastor specifically set aside. And I think that could be one approach in the future that we see more of. And it makes sense because as you'll see at the end of the webinar, I think one of the sort of things that really matters is I think folks who are really able to dive in and really get to know the best research and the best knowledge and understanding of a digital context are the folks who are going to be able to translate what they do into that context. And so it'll make sense to have that congregations who set aside some staff to specifically explore, get to know, be missionaries to that context, if you will. I think those are congregations that are going to have a lot of success at it. It'll work both ways. My personal preference, I think, would be to piggyback on the in-person worship, because I think there's something really powerful about that interplay. And there's some really exciting things that are being done by congregations to mix those two communities. And some of that's, I think, some of the more exciting stuff.
Another question for you, Dr. Snyder. I found that folks have become very laid back while worshiping in their homes. They get up, move around, play with their pets, get food, eat, etc. What can you recommend to maintain a feeling of actual worship going on? I want folks to be comfortable, but I can't imagine they'd behave this way in face-to-face worship.
This is a complicated question. I think because on the one hand, I have a lot of sympathy for this question. I've seen some, we'll just say, weird stuff on Zoom worship that I've been a part of. And in one sense, the person who's asking this question is exactly right. I want, certainly they would not behave this way in person. It may help on the one hand to be explicit about your expectations of folks. Again, I think this is a place where being very specific about the kind of participation and presence you're inviting can go a long way. On the other hand, it is a global pandemic. And I personally, especially in my teaching, I work a lot with students, and this is my philosophy with students. I think we all need a fair amount of grace right now. And so I also think that, use good pastoral wisdom. Is this a moment to really bring down the hammer and, call out certain behaviors? Maybe. On the other hand, this might also be a moment to extend grace and to, maybe, cross that bridge when we get there. Let's get maybe 6 months on the other side of that pandemic. And if we're still experiencing that kind of behavior, maybe we take another approach at that point. It's tough, though. I have a lot of sympathy for this. And I think a lot of us have experienced that to be the case, to be that there is a kind of more relaxed deal.
Some interesting questions in response to that. How can we allow some of that informality to happen in our churches? Why prevent people from relaxing and interacting with worship while being family? How do we make our in-person worship more relaxed? What do you think?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think it depends a lot on your people. There's about 200 folks on the webinar, so I won't pretend to be an expert on everybody's context, but there are certainly, we've heard pastors tell the history of their congregations, to tell the story of how their congregation got to this point. This was something that we were planning on doing in our research before the pandemic, but the pandemic has made it very interesting. And it's very clear that some pastors tell stories where it's pretty clear that these congregations would benefit from being more relaxed, introducing a lot more casual sort of atmosphere into the mix. By and large, American culture is way more relaxed and casual than it was 30, 40, 50 years ago. You see that particularly, for example, in business attire. What used to count as business attire is, really has relaxed quite a bit. And so that's just one example, but again, by and large, American culture is more casual today than it was, several decades ago. And it might make sense for the church to come alongside that and meet people where they are. On the other hand, there's a lot of congregations, not in terms of what they wear and so forth, but there's a lot of other congregations that I think could benefit, maybe not from dressing up more, but from being a little bit more engaged, a little bit more into the moment, a little bit more present, and a little bit less casual about what it means for them to be church. And so I think you just have to sort of really pay attention to listen to a lot of the stories, listen to your people, get to know where they're coming from, hear the collective story of the congregation, and sort of think, if you can't collaborate, is this a congregation that needs to be, unsettled and made more casual, or do we need to actually be a little bit more formal, a little bit more intentional about our choices and so forth? I think it can go both ways.
Question about families and children. We found that our families with school-aged children are struggling to stay engaged and feel connected with digital worship. What do you think we should do?
Yeah, this is challenging. We began to see this back in September. We took a few months off from our research when we were under sort of lockdown orders here in Washington, D.C. But as we began to get back into the field doing our research and meeting with congregations, of course, all of our meetings are digital meetings, lots of Zoom meetings for me. We began to hear exactly these kind of reports specifically from families. I think this is challenging. I think we have seen a couple of different things that I think are interesting responses. I think the most important response here is grace. One of the things that the pandemic did was it exposed some of the things that were very challenging for congregations to begin with. And one of the challenges when it comes to family faith formation is that in many congregations, faith formation is sort of outsourced to the programmatic staff of the congregation. And the youth ministry research that we have is really quite clear about the importance of faith practices in the home. And I think for a lot of folks, there just wasn't that kind of foundation of faith practices in the home. And so when the pandemic hit and all faith formation had to happen in the home, that was just a lot to expect, especially when families were burdened with having to also provide education in the homes and do everything else, including continue to hold jobs and all the rest. So that's why I think the sort of main response is probably grace and noticing it, paying attention to it, and knowing that that's going to have to be something that we put a lot more energy into in the future. They're thinking a lot about this in schools, for example. A lot of educators, elementary educators, are simply saying, you know what, we're just behind. We're just going to be behind, and we're going to have to deal with this. We're going to have a long-term solution that deals with this, and we're in order to make up for lost time. And I think to a certain extent that might be true in faith formation. There might also be possibilities for better resourcing families themselves. We have a couple of instances in our research where congregations have used their space and worked it out with the guidelines in their local context, the public health guidelines, to create small spaces, learning pods, where they can welcome children with volunteers and help them participate in their online schooling and give parents a break. I think that's a really important thing. Really helps that, and kind of that can, I think, rejuvenate the whole system, and I think that can be quite helpful. But by and large, I think this is one that I think we would do well to extend a fair amount of grace on this one. Yeah.
We do have some other questions. What I'd like to suggest is, Dr. Snyder, if we can submit these questions to you, that you could answer them, and we can send out the answers tomorrow.
Yeah, that sounds great.
Okay, great.
We might have a few more minutes here at the very end to take another question or two as well. So let's keep going, and let's see if we can get to that point where we might have time for a question or two, and then we'll follow up. We'll include as many answers to your questions as we can in this handout as well. That'll also kind of help get a lot more questions answered. All right. I want to sort of talk a little bit here. We're coming up on the end of our time together. And it struck me that it would be helpful to talk a little bit about some of the just basic do's and don'ts of digital worship. For some people, translating their worship into the digital context has come quite a bit more naturally to some than others. And so I think it's helpful just to think together about some of the things that we've seen be very helpful and some of the things that haven't been so helpful. So here's some of the do's and don'ts that I think we've seen. In some ways, I hate to kind of make this a binary, do this, don't do this, but it's still helpful, I think, to think about. So let's go through this together. Again, one of the most important thing you can be doing is to translate your worship into a digital context. I think that means spending a lot of time with, as much as possible anyway, with your leadership, really getting to know what it is that really outside of the pandemic or outside of digital worship, what is it that your congregation holds most closely? What are its values? What are its personality? What makes it different than other places of worship? And to hold on to those things, let those things be the very materials, the very center that gets translated, and then some of those other details can be left to the side. But it's very important, again, to translate your worship. And the sort of corresponding don't here is, of course, that I think it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, to try to do exactly what you were doing in person, just in a digital context. In fact, that's not translation. So when we see things kind of getting really awkward or uncomfortable or perhaps not working so well, most often what we're seeing there is somebody trying to replicate something that works in person, and it's just not ever going to work in digital culture. And so we see that often, and it can be painful to see sometimes, but it's still happening quite a bit. I think it's really important to choose a platform that fits the world that your worship is trying to imagine. Of course, we always have to make these choices within certain limitations. But I think choosing your platform just because others are doing it, or because you already know how to do it at this point, or even worse, because of the costs, can be very, very problematic. We've seen a good number of congregations that are, I think, unnecessarily restraining themselves because of the platform that they've chosen. Now, like I said earlier, especially on the broadcasting front, that can cost a significant amount of money, and both in terms of the investment in the technology, but then also in terms of staffing it. And I think when we all started this a year ago, it was in the context of an emergency, and so I think maybe many of us chose things that we just didn't have the luxury of stepping back and asking some of the questions I'm encouraging everybody to think about today. So that kind of quick decision just to get up and running aside, the reality is that even on the broadcasting front today, with a few $100s, maybe $1,000, you can put together a really quality audio and visual experience. It doesn't take nearly what it used to even a few short years ago. The technology has just really come along, and we'll make a few recommendations in our handout of some of the products that I've worked with and that I quite like. But I think it's best, again, to choose the platform that fits the design of what it is you're trying to do. This third bullet point here is, you've already heard us allude to this, but this is not something that you're going to want to try as a solo act. It's not going to end well. I'm thinking about a congregation that's in our research study that a few years ago would never have allowed women to participate in the leadership of the church. Now, for about the last decade, this church has been working really intentional towards full inclusion of women in the church's leadership. And that's a good thing, because when the pandemic hit, this pastor, who's a little bit older than other pastors I know, not very good with technology. And he handed it over to his two daughters and to his wife, who works in the business world. And so she's very familiar with Zoom. And so is his daughter, very tech savvy. And now these three women are the only reason that this church can do any digital worship whatsoever. So if it wasn't for the women, this church would be sunk, which is, I think, true in a lot of our cases, right? But nonetheless, this is not a time to try a solo act. This is a time to draw on the gifts and talents of your people. And, we've seen that in our research time and again. We've heard that congregations are reaching out and creating new kinds of leadership opportunities for new kinds of leadership roles, whether that's volunteer roles or staff roles. And often they're finding that God has provided exactly what they need if they just invite other people who do have those gifts and talents to serve alongside them. They're really able to expand who gets to be included in leadership. It's been a beautiful thing. One of the things that I think is it's easy to say, but it's difficult to practice, is there's this idea within software development, within the technology world, of iterative design. And this is the idea that you start with something that might be in the beta mode, right? It's a prototype, and you put that out into the world, and you give it to users, and you let them play around with it and break it and see what happens. And then you make a better one, and then you give it back to them, you let them break it, and then you make an even better one. Google wasn't really all that good when they first released it. And they had to make these changes, little change by little change by little change by little change. That's what we saw, and it's what we were trying to highlight in that first case study. But this is a congregation that's sort of constantly soliciting feedback and implementing those changes one piece at a time. I think what can become very exhausting for pastors is to sort of imagine fixing everything at once. And many pastors that we're working with are just exhausted. They've been exhausted by the past year. Ministry is difficult to begin with, much less ministry in a pandemic. And the idea of sort of wholesale fixing something is really difficult to imagine. Plus, many of us are hoping that we can soon return to in-person worship, and then maybe we can just set this on the shelf and never have to deal with it again. But if you can, I think it's important to solicit that feedback and implement as many changes as possible. Finally, there is a real wealth of knowledge and research on digital faith practices, but very little of the worship that we've participated in seems to be connected to what it is researchers and scholars already know about the practice of religion online. And so I would encourage folks to not feel like they have to reinvent the wheel, to set aside a little bit of time to maybe do some continuing education, which you're already doing, of course, by participating in this webinar, which is really fantastic, but to familiarize yourself with what other people know about this context. If we were taking our worship services to, to a missionary context, and we were going to take this halfway around the world, we would probably want to get to know something about that context, that culture, to know their customs and their language, what makes sense in that place. And that's the way that digital contexts work too. We have to sort of learn the language. We have to sort of do that. But the good news is a lot of people have already put in the difficult work for us. We don't have to do all that. We can benefit from what researchers and scholars already know about the practice of digital faith online. So this is a great opportunity. It's a great time for us to be in the situation that we're in. We'll include some of those resources that we have found most helpful in the packet that we'll send out as a follow-up. Before we close, I want to make sure that you have a little bit of information about some of the next steps that you can take. We're going to be hosting a couple of follow-up workshops. We've had several people. Well, we've had a bunch of people who were not even able to register for this webinar because we maxed out, unfortunately. And but nonetheless, we're going to have some follow-up workshops because we realize that this work of translation often is very contextual. It's very situational to you and your context. And we know that some of you might like the opportunity to work with us more carefully, working through some of your specific challenges and problems. And we would love to do that with you. So we've created an opportunity to do just that. On April 14th and April 21st, we're going to host the first two of these workshops. You can register for one of these workshops at churchleadership.com/workshop. You're hearing about these first, so you'll have the first opportunity to sign up. And that's important because the registration is limited to 20. As you can see, they're 2-hour workshops. And these workshops, these will be more like Zoom meetings. And so we'll actually be able to break out into small groups, and people who are doing Zoom worship can gather with other Zoom worship, but people who are doing live streaming can break out into groups of live streaming and all bounce around to different small groups. And we'll actually hear more from you about your context, and we'll think very contextually with you about how we can solve some of the challenges that you're facing. So this workshop would be a great opportunity for folks who want to go even deeper into some of this material. So there you have it, churchleadership.com/workshop. And I think Matt is going to also put a link there in the chat so that you have access to that. We'll include it in the follow-up materials as well. Another thing, we want to practice what we preach about iterative design. And so we would like to invite you to help us make this webinar even better. If you would go to churchleadership.com/evaluation, we're going to also put a link to this in the chat. We'll also follow up with you by email because we're really serious about evaluation here at the Lewis Center for Church Leadership. But this would really help us. We really care about how you experience this webinar. We want to know what it is that you found helpful, and if there's things that we can do to improve this before we offer it again. So we have just a minute or two left. Matt, do we have a pressing question that we can end on?
This is a good one. I mean, we've done pretty well with getting our regular members to join us via live stream, but how can we engage visitors during this time?
Yeah, I think so in acting, there is this thing called the fourth wall. And it's this idea that there's this perception that there's a sort of gap, right? The audience can see you, but the actors can't see the audience. And there have been some shows recently that have sort of intentionally broken this fourth wall. If you're a fan of The Office, it's probably like one of the best known examples of that, where they just look directly at the camera and talk to the audience, right? I think that's what we have to do with visitors. We actually have to address them. We have to welcome them. We have to name them. We have to train people how to appropriately welcome them so that they're not overbearing. Just like the best way to do this in a digital context is to get a group of folks together and to imagine you were going to be a visitor in somebody else's, or even better yet, go visit other churches in their digital worship and glean from that what it is that would be helpful to on-ramp into a new community like that. And then develop some training to really help invite your visitors to do very specific things. If you want them to send a text message so that you can follow up, if you want them to fill out some kind of registration or sign up form so that you can follow up, but also give permission for folks to be a little bit more anonymous. It can be very difficult and very intimidating to visit a church for the first time, much less during a pandemic or in a digital context. So one of my favorite things is I was a part of a church that was a mission start church. It was a new church plant. And for the first 5 years, they were meeting in this church that had a big balcony, and they intentionally kept the lights underneath the balcony dark so that people who wanted to just slip in and slip out without being noticed could. I think that's also an important part. Let people engage on their own terms. If people want to engage, they will. Make those engagements easy and warm, inviting, and effective, but also let people engage on their own terms. As we close out here, I would like to share with you just a brief prayer. You might be familiar with Saint Teresa of Avila. She had a famous prayer that many people are familiar with. It begins with these words that Christ has no body but yours, no hands and no feet on earth but yours. It goes on and on. It's a beautiful prayer. Meredith Gold, who's a social media theorist, has really adapted this for living faithfully in a digital world. And I want to offer it to you as a way of concluding this time that we've been able to spend together. So will you pray with me? Christ has no online presence but yours, no blog, no live stream, no Facebook page but yours. Yours are the tweets through which love touches the world. Yours are the posts through which the gospel is shared. Yours are the updates and the emails through which hope is revealed. Christ has no online presence but yours. No blog, no Zoom meeting, no Facebook page but yours. I want to thank everyone for being a part of the webinar today. We'll have a recording sent out soon. And I hope you enjoyed this time together. I know I have. On behalf of the Lewis Center for Church Leadership and Wesley Theological Seminary, thank you. Know that you're in our prayers as you engage in ministry in this difficult time. Thanks, everyone.